Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. Over the last few weeks, the future of war has suddenly felt like it is right here in the present. In arena after arena, the era of manned, mechanized warfare is being supplanted by drone-on-drone fighting, changing the very nature of conflict. What does that mean for how countries arm themselves? In a moment, I will speak with a top expert who has advised six US Secretaries of Defense. If this is your first time joining us on FP Live, welcome. We will take some subscriber questions. As always, if you would like to join in, use the code FP Live for a discount. We are also a podcast. Just look for FP Live on your favorite audio platform. So the world is still digesting what is being called Operation Spiderweb, an unprecedented surprise move by Ukraine to send more than 100 drones to destroy a couple dozen Russian strategic bombers. The drones cost about $300 each. The bombers were each worth 100 million. Now, while this one attack won't change the course of the war, it was a real David versus Goliath moment, and it comes as drones have also played salient roles recently between India and Pakistan, as well as in the Middle East. And to be clear, this discussion isn't just going to be about drones. When you add in AI and the fact that countries are beginning to prioritize warfare over other areas of spending, we're entering a dangerous new world. How do we navigate all these changes? Joining me now is Mara Karlin, a professor at Johns Hopkins University. She's held many top policymaking jobs in government. Most recently, she served the Biden administration as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Mara, welcome to FP Live.
Thank you so much for having me, Ravi.
It's great to have you on. We have to start with Ukraine's audacious drone attacks on Russia on the 1st of June. And I've heard two takes, really. One is that the attacks showcased Ukrainian ingenuity and that they were able to cause billions of dollars of damage to Russia. In other words, this was a watershed moment. But there's another school of thought that it doesn't actually change the status quo in the war. What do you think?
So, what's fascinating about this spectacular and stunning operation by Ukraine is it actually demonstrates that a lot of kind of themes that we've seen in warfare over the years, over centuries, are actually still really relevant, right? So, the role of information operations, it's still not entirely clear how many of the strategic bombers that Ukraine destroyed, definitely a lot, but the Ukrainians are saying 40. The Russians are saying, oh, just a handful, don't worry. So the salience of information operations, which we've seen since time immemorial, we see the continued salience of surprise, no shortage of historic examples along those lines. We see the criticality of strategic planning. So the Ukrainians have said they have been planning this operation for a year and a half. Really shows how they've been trying to figure out what are ways to try to shapeshift this conflict. So it was a really interesting move to hit fixed bases, which we've always known are getting increasingly threatened. And that's frankly part of the reason the US military has tried to invest in dispersal and in resilience and hardening with its bases. It does not completely change the face of this war. Absolutely not. It's going to make things harder for the Russians. These are not easy planes to replace. You know how pricey they are. They also just take a really long time to develop.
Right. And you said there that this was at least a year and a half in the works. And that is notable to me, but also the fact that there are reports that President Zelensky was personally involved in this decision and that he'd been waiting to find the right moment. Do you have any sense of whether he held off on such an operation when Biden was in office, when you were in office, because he had any sense that the White House didn't want him to escalate?
I can't speak to that. I have no idea. It's quite possible that he was just waiting for the moment to be ripe. You know, in response to your first question, I've been comparing Operation Spiderweb a lot to what we saw the Israelis do with the Patriot attacks against Hezbollah last fall. And I think these at least rhyme a little bit because they're both tied to the strategic picture. They're both obviously like stunning operations, pretty spectacular ones. But frankly, it would seem to me the Israeli operation against Hezbollah that injured at least a couple thousand Hezbollah operatives, that has more of a game-changing feel on the state of
Mm.
Hezbollah than we see here with Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb and the kind of lack of game-changing impact on the Russians.
Well, there's another, since you bring up the Israeli attack on Hezbollah's pages, which for, our viewers and listeners who aren't that familiar with it, this was basically the Israeli side getting into the supply chains long ahead of time and able to basically plant ticking time bombs on the Hezbollah operatives. But the difference here, Mara, if I may, is that if the Ukraine-Russia drone attack was David Goliath, the Israel Hezbollah one was the opposite, right? Where more resources on the Israeli end allowed them to innovate more, to get in the supply chains ahead of time, which I guess raises the question, does more technology level the playing field, or does it allow for asymmetrical uses?
So there's actually a temporal answer, I think, to that great question, which is in the short term, it does help level the playing field. But the story of military innovation, frankly, is a little bit less of who gets there first, who gets the special capability or technology first. It's more who's able to integrate it, who's able to scale it, who's really able to adapt their force to it. So yes, I think in the short term, it actually helps the scrappy folks a little bit more.
Hmm.
But in the medium to long term, that's probably not definitive.
Hmm. Let's come back to drones a little bit because it's striking to me that they've become so salient, not just in Ukraine, but in so many other arenas. So Iran and Israel over the last couple of years,
Hmm.
and then more recently between India and Pakistan, which have fought many wars before, but never before with drones until last month. I'm wondering how you are looking at that trend. What does it mean that each of these countries are relying more on drones? And also, it's very telling that in each of these cases, you have one or more nuclear powers involved.
Absolutely. I mean, we have so much more to learn about that India-Pakistan sort of brief conflict that recently occurred. It does demonstrate a couple intriguing things. So one is something we see in like wonky literature is the stability and stability paradox. Effectively, you've got nuclear powers in India and Pakistan, and they're actually more likely to be comfortable escalating below that, right? Conventionally, or you can imagine in like a hybrid or gray zone warfare. So we did see that happen in this scenario. We also, kind of like we were just saying with Ukraine, really witnessed the relevance of information operations again. I mean, I'm still finding it really hard to figure out what exactly happened. We heard all these rumors throughout it, like the Pakistani army chief allegedly being under house arrest, even the issues of attribution. The Indians immediately said it's Lashkar-e-Taiba. I don't know that they gave a ton of evidence for that,
They have
but so
not.
right, so information operations kind of played a notable role here. It's also not at all clear why folks ultimately de-escalated. Was it the U.S. role, which started passive, became more active? Was it that both parties kind of got out what they needed? I don't know. But on the drone piece specifically, my colleague Josh White has this really nice kind of approach to describing it. He says, it might be that drones are in the murky middle of how we think about escalation. You've got artillery on sort of the lower end, you've got sort of cruise and ballistic missiles on the higher end, and in the murky middle, I mean, that's always the complicated spot anyway. And he puts them in that as well. And so as we learn more about what really happened in this recent conflict, I think we'll be able to figure out, is that the right spot or should they move more to the left or the right?
Hmm. The other interesting thing about drones that has struck me as a comparison point between India and Pakistan and then Russia and Ukraine is that with India and Pakistan, it led to a shorter, sharper war. In other words, it escalated really, really quickly and then it de-escalated really quickly. And we're not
Hmm.
entirely clear, as we've been discussing, why that de-escalation happened. But
Hmm.
on the other hand, in Russia and Ukraine, the fact that you have the use of drones has, in some senses, allowed both sides to prolong the war, to paper over some of the manpower difficulties that
Mhm.
especially the Ukrainians are facing. So again, I mean, this is one of those instances where drones can both prolong but also shorten wars.
Quite possibly. What is a huge question, though, in the India-Pakistan case is that both do have nuclear weapons. And it is for
Mm.
a long time been in their interest to have these short, sharp conflicts. And so what I can't figure out is how much of this is drones, how much of this is maybe due to the like idiosyncratic nature of the sort of conflict between those two over years.
That's a very good point. So, since you bring up nukes, let's go there a little bit because it seems like there's been a shift for many countries in how they're thinking about their nuclear doctrines. Can you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely. So look, the whole issue of nuclear weapons has obviously taken on a greater salience over the last few years, not least because of Russian saber rattling vis-a-vis Ukraine. What has been so striking to me is to hear how that dialogue has shifted across Europe, across the Indo-Pacific, where you now hear countries talking about getting latent capabilities, maybe even more than that, and a bunch of countries that you might not have thought having these conversations. South Korea, Japan, Germany, Sweden's second largest political party, Poland. It's increasingly becoming sort of a part of the conversation, and that does make a lot of sense. I mean, I think a lot of folks wonder if Ukraine still had nuclear weapons today, what would be the state of that conflict? Would Russia have even launched it? So what's intriguing to me is it's just a loud dialogue now among a bunch of folks who weren't talking about it before, say, like 5 years ago or 10 years ago. B, these folks are largely US partners and allies. And so for the last couple of decades, when the United States has done kind of defense planning and thought about nuclear weapons, it's usually, uh-oh, I don't want my adversaries, or my enemies to get those. How do you think about it when it relates to your partners or your allies, especially if it's allies who you have this agreement of extended deterrence with and who are effectively saying, we don't totally trust that compact anymore? It's just a totally different set of dilemmas now.